I've spoken to a lot of postmasters. I've spoken to at least 3 who went to prison, who done absolutely nothing wrong, innocent people in prison by these kind of ways. So, let's have it clear here. At the end of it all, the way that this has been done, getting heads on plates, getting people banged away for nothing, is just, again, it's just beyond reprehensible, isn't it? Fraud is unique as a crime for quite a range of reasons. There's no scene of crime. Sometimes the effects are not felt until much, much further down the line. And in modern times with cyber attacks and all these scams, it is so rare, if ever, that the perpetrator has actual contact with the victim at all. Where's the evidence here? What you have is information. What you have is data coming from an information from a machine. This is not evidence yet, it's information. So as investigators, we should appraise the journey from data, information to evidence and deal with it. This is what we do. This is the biggest miscarriage of justice in history. This is why. And I think also at the same time, the reason we can say it so confidently is because you compare this to other instances of the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6. The difference is with those that we had crime, we had evidence of crime. Yeah, we had carnage, we had mayhem, we had scenes, victims, everything. People were punished for crime. Obviously, it went sideways when the police corruption put the wrong people in prison, basically, and off they went on appeal. This is different. This time we're getting people punished for crime with no crime committed. So this is, for me, makes it an even worse aggravating feature as far as miscarriages of justice are concerned. And I think happening, 736 times over, brings in all these kinds of other collateral problems that comes with corrupt investigations and styles, so to speak. So I think that's worth mentioning. I also want to mention the fact that this is my 10 seconds, if you like, a tribute to every single one of these innocent postmasters who were put through the ringer, hell and back, by this, what shall I call them, this kind of prosecution-mongering oligarchy called the Post Office. Their behavior has been deplorable. And I think the investigations that have taken place within this kind of regime have just been against every single grain of ethics, skill, professionalism, legality that you can imagine. And I also think the fact that about private prosecutions, before we go on to the evidence side of it, private prosecutions, in February 2020, there was a Commons debate in the so-called aftermath, which is not the aftermath yet, is it, about private prosecutions. Now, some MPs were calling for the reform of the Prosecution of Offences Act 1985. Now, I don't buy into this. Some of them were calling it for them to be abolished altogether because of the miscarriages of justice and the appeal cases and things like it. Now, in all honesty, private prosecutions, we wouldn't be very far down the road of enforcement without them. Only last week, we had the largest ever kind of land-based fraud legalized, this kind of inward workings of fraud within land purchases. And it was prosecuted by private prosecution, very, very high caliber. And it's the biggest in history. Day to day, we're seeing some very good successes with private prosecutions in day-to-day issues like fraudulent training, counterfeit goods. Without private prosecutions, we really wouldn't be getting far at all. So I don't buy into just stopping it for the sake of stopping it. What I'm against is the abuse of it, which is what the Post Office have done royally.
Well, one of the things you're saying is that you're drawing attention to the appalling circumstances, that there isn't even evidence of a crime, although crimes may have been committed, but not by these sub-postmasters. And the unfortunate thing is, as time goes by, drawing out the investigation, drawing out the reviews, you can forget how appalling their experience has been.
Well, George, I agree with every word of that. I think what we ought to do at the moment is just simply take a step back with this, because obviously we're going to talk about these kind of perspectives of groupthink and all the rest of that. But I think we take a step back for a moment, just look at the crime of fraud for a moment and how you will deal with it. First of all, in a few seconds, fraud I go around the world, well, not so much now with traveling restrictions, but I still am very active with training of fraud investigation courses. And one of the first things I ever ask is, what is fraud? And I can have 10 auditors in front of me, and I'll guarantee you there are 10 different answers going to come to me. Now, this is not about being critical of auditors or anyone else. It's the very nature of the beast. Fraud is unique as a crime for quite a range of reasons. There's no scene of crime. Sometimes the effects are not felt until much, much further down the line. And in modern times with cyber attacks and all these scams, it is so rare, if ever, that the perpetrator has actual contact with the victim at all. Yet they've taken their money, but they've never spoken. I'm trying to sell you this watch, which is a Rolex, whatever it is, which it certainly isn't, and all this kind of thing. This is the way it goes. And again, the way that victims and victimhood is portrayed in fraud. To be a victim of fraud is to be made a fool of, basically, in any context. And corporates don't like it. Turn that around on its head, and it's happened where we get this, what I call stage managed victimhood. An example of that is, of course, the famous Bernie Tolpe, Frenchman. He is the former owner of Adidas and the former president or owner of Marseille Football Club. He was awarded 440 million euros of taxpayers' money in compensation because he kind of worked his way. He went to prison twice for fraud. And he actually got to a point where he was awarded public money because he set himself up and fraudulently set himself up as a victim of fraud. Now, this is what's happened, I think, in the post office, without any question. What they've done actually is kind of engineer themselves and actually smeared an entire workforce, portraying themselves up as some kind of pseudo corporate fraud victim when they are nothing of the sort. Basically, certainly in the context of these cases that have been overturned, if you will, on the 23rd of April this year in the Court of Appeal. Not only overturned or found unsafe, they have been now an affront to the public conscience, maliciously brought. So that really, the courts at the highest levels in the country have really gone to town on this and making these very strong assertions beyond the normal, it's unsafe, so we'll kick it. This is maliciously brought. Now, maybe 1/8 of all those 736 prosecutions, you may think that's a small number, but let's not be fooled. You know, you mentioned about the CCRC. There are many, many more cases to come, many more. And I think really now it's a kind of exercise in damage limitation of stopping the numbers of maliciously brought cases being brought to the public. So fraud is unique. Also, if you want to combat it, to your question, George, you want to risk assess internally, don't you? You should do. If you own a company that's got an internal risk of fraud, you need a risk assessment. And as I always say with clients and everyone else I work with, is, you know, hope for the best, plan for the worst. So if you're kind of anything like it, where was the risk assessment in the post office prior to these cases? Probably non-existent. What we have is, oh, we've got a new Horizon system. Okay, great. X billion pounds worth of kit rolled out. Postmasters do their accounting. They can do their day-to-day business, stock taking through using the Horizon system. Wonderful. Then the complaints start, or the concerns. Of course, this doesn't work like you would do. This is not working. People are phoning. And then this is where the groupthink side started to build up. And we'll come back to a bit more detail with this a bit later. And then it's got to it. This is where this hideous transformation came, whereby a tiny substrata of management authority then actually just bubbled over into this horrible mass of this, we're going to prosecute you, you must be committing fraud. I mean, as I said very early on, we talk about this, what kind of evidence, coming to your point, Jill, where's the evidence here? What you have is information. What you have is data coming from an information from a machine. This is not evidence yet, it's information. So as investigators, we should appraise the journey from data, information to evidence and deal with it. This is what we do. We don't say, oh yeah, well, okay, we've got no evidence of fraud against you, but we're going to use fraud as a deciding factor anyway. It's preposterous, isn't it? you know, and this is the way it's all gone. They've engineered this terrible wave of misinformation, abuse of process, and it all started with this kind of thinking about, this is our system, it's wonderful, and woe betide anyone who questions it.
Ian, can I just ask, I think for many people the question would be, why is the Horizon data not evidence? What would be evidence, given the information that Horizon was giving them? What would you, as an investigator, look for as actual evidence?
Well, really, like I say, you've got to, first of all, appraise what you have. All information is valuable. And at the end of it all, it's how you actually appraise it. It's just so crucial at the beginning of how you handle the data, totally without being led. For example, now, you say, what would you look for? Well, what's gone wrong horribly, which is evidently so in the post office investigations, are that people have been called into a meeting or given a memo or some kind and say, this is what's happened. But my response to that will be no, no, and thrice no. Show me the evidence, please. You know, and the thing is this, with this information, you can easily get an expert, which has happened, of course, and say, oh yeah, Horizon works perfectly well. It's robust, that word again. It's reliable, and that's it. Now, what anyone, an investigator myself, would say, okay, this is information that comes from an IT system. Okay, how does this equate to evidence of fraud, first of all? And I would be asking myself, again, with this wonderful model that I've been privileged to work with, the unmasking linear sequence of decision-making that not many people choose to do, but that's my thing. And I've always been very safe in the knowledge to say that my decisions, based upon appraising evidence, are based upon the driving out. So I'm bringing in a bit of mindset here, George, to answer you. Drive out the bias, drive out the groupthink, and you're left with a proper way of making decisions on the metrics of the case. So the first thing you're not looking for is evidence. You're looking for the decision-making benchmarks of what it might become evidence. So I hope that answers you.
Okay, so can you give us a kind of illustration of what that might be?
Right. Well, first of all, if you get a printout from Horizon system and say, okay, I've got a load of facts and figures, I've got some dates. It's written in a typical accountancy language. It's very coded. I'm not an accountant. I don't pretend that I am, but I know about accountancy fraud to a basic extent. So I will simply go to a proper person, not say an accountant, and say, okay, there's the accountant's advice. Explain this to me. I won't say to the accountant and say, is this fraud or not? I'll take this then to a legal person, in-house counsel or someone, and say, okay, I've had the explanation. Here's a brief resume from the accountant. Any fraud in here at all? Before I even speak to anyone else. So I'd be looking myself and I'll say, where's the misrepresentation? You don't have fraud without a misrepresentation. It isn't legally possible to do. Is there a theft here? Is it possible? So these are the kind of basic benchmarks I'd be looking at. Then if there was some kind of indication, or that word I don't use, red flags, that term again, you're not looking for damning evidence here and there, guilt, innocence here and now. It's what I call the here and now trap. Once you've got this information, you think there's any kind of modicum of evidence in it, then you're going to take it, and then you're going to say, okay, this is now where I start to plan the investigation.
And if you're saying to a lawyer, well, is there evidence of misrepresentation with these sub-postmasters, for example?
Yeah.
Misrepresentation would be that there's some other thing other than just the Horizon printout, which suggests that somebody's misrepresented their circumstances.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, it is, yeah. But I think also what you have to remember is the fact that sometimes you will, in all honesty and experience, will say, if you find one element of fraud, you will open up a can of worms into others. In more than one occasion, I've actually dealt with, for want of a better way of saying it, with a fraud offender who's running 4 and 5 scams at the same time, and especially in a kind of corporate retail environment. And I've encountered that more than one time.
So you find one discrepancy, and that usually leads to others.
It can do very easily, yeah.
Right.
But I think what I find totally incredible in this case, for example, you've spoken with Nikki Arch, haven't you? And you've spoken to a couple of others of the postmasters. If you just take this case alone, they were simply funneled, fixated on, this is the system, you're a thief, you're a fraudster, that's it. No one bothered to look for anything at all, you know, and, you know, we know by now, Nikki never stole a penny from anyone. It's as easy as that. And so going to your point, if the printout gives a certain printout, gives a certain reading, gives certain data, yeah, what you have to understand is, well, no one is bothering to look for anything other than fraud. They've already decided, yeah, this is fraud, yeah, this is it. And it shows you this kind of tunnel vision that they have.
And the evidence for that, Ian, is the fact that they attend a post office, they do whatever they do. I don't really understand it, but they do something. Yeah.
They look in the safe and look at the paperwork.
Yeah. They then immediately take people off somewhere. It could be a police station. It could be a post office. It's a room where there's a tape. And they know what they're going to be doing from the beginning, don't they? They're going to try and get a confession out of these people. They've done nothing at all like you have just described about gathering in the information. And if they did it properly, they should have had to have left the post office and gone back and done it properly.
Well, this is the whole point. You hit the nail on the head, Jill, honestly. When you say investigation, evidence, I mean, it's nothing of the sort, is it? I mean, in this particular case, let's just briefly through, I'm going to insert the elements of groupthink. I think it's so crucial here because, again, I'm kind of supporting the answer to your question. When we have groupthink, if you think of it just in 10 seconds, look at groupthink. I mean, Stalin was one of the great exponents of groupthink. He had the whole of Russia thinking that the state was higher than God. Yeah. Break this down then into an investigations context. It comes to your point. We had Operation Midland, didn't we? The Metropolitan Police, etc., with those politicians. Then we had Operation U-Tree, yeah, politely known as a celebrity witch hunt. Now you break this into the post office, yeah. Now look at Nikki's case, and I have spoken to Nikki, and the cases and people I'm mentioning, I do have their permission to say this. Now, yeah, what we had there was computer says yes. I've got a clockwork wound up in my back. Off I come and go and get you. So we had the first of all, we had the scheduled audit by one man who went to her, which is perfectly fine, perfectly normal in this kind of contractual setup, to go and do a random audit. Good. But auditors, and I've been an auditor myself, are meant to write audit reports, aren't they? You know, I come to your post office, I do an audit, I send you a report. That's how it should work, I think, instead of withholding things. Yeah. What happened instead was then that the same auditor returned with these accompanied by this other two, the male and female, on that particular morning of October 2000 at the small post office in Gloucestershire. Yeah. Yeah. So without repeating what Nikki said to you, let me put a bit more kind of focus on other points of this. Is first of all, they turned up there. The auditor made a few comments, whatever. He never once produced an audit report to say, this is something we need to discuss, or we found a non-conformance, you know, the usual audit language, which is fine. It needs explaining between us. But no, what we had was three of them turning up there with the old surprise visit. And then, I mean, Nikki, I think at the time she mentioned she was like in her mid-20s or something at the time. And you're going to put up with this, as she puts, bullshit, quote unquote. And she's right. And then next thing is one of them pipes up, the male of these two protagonists, the male officer, we'll call him, said, oh, you're not balancing, are you? First opening volley. And she looks and says, sorry, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are even. Oh, well, no proper introduction, no identification, none of that. It was a case of you need to come with us. What? And yeah, that was it. But she got pretty scared, no question. And then they looked around the place, and on the car journey over to Stroud Post Office, some comments like, oh yeah, have you been on holiday? Did the post office pay for all that? You know, it got pretty sick, in all honesty. And by the time they got to the Stroud post office, they paraded her through a public post office like a war criminal, ushered her into a room and locked her in for 6 hours. 6 hours. Now, you look at this, and then it was a case of the recording equipment was already in there. They'd never even identified who they were and what they were going to be doing. Now, really, if you're going to carry out a criminal investigation of some kind, okay, the police are not going to say, dear sir, we're coming to arrest you at 9 o'clock. No. But under PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, all right, I'm showing my age a bit. When I was a probationary officer, when PACE came in, and all the rest of it, and when tape recorded interviews started, I was there at the beginning. But now, what the point I'm driving at here, if someone's going to be interviewed on a voluntary basis, then it should be made clear what it's all about. You can't just go bowling in and, like the guy started saying, right, I'm ex-CID, yeah, and you're a thief. I know a thief when I see one. I've seen your kind before. I thought, when she told me this, and when I saw it again reaffirmed in an interview with you, I thought, I'm going like this, you know. Unfortunately, again, you're going to get this kind of officer, ex-officer, who brings the bad reputation, and all the others who do a good job in their respective new roles and careers and all the rest of it. But there is a certain species that do not, unfortunately, and this was one of them. And the point I'm making that is because he is one who dragged in all kinds of bad investigation habits with him. And coming back to your point, Jill, is this is all it was. There was no caution. Yeah, you do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Not one single word of this in 6 hours. They locked her in.
No lawyer.
No lawyer, no chance. Yeah, I mean, for all intents purposes, this is like a fantasy sort of scenario. It was denied. It's like a bad dream. It never happened. It was denied. It was totally, utterly illegal. So, and then it wasn't as though, as we called it, that Nikki went no comment, because she did not. She answered every single question.
But she didn't give the answers that they wanted, Ian.
No, of course not. Well, this is the whole point, Jill. In all honesty, again, it sounds very simple, but unfortunately with him, and it does still pain me when I still see certain trainings going ahead, is what should have happened is very simple. I mean, I'm terrible with names. It doesn't make me a bad person. Other people, when you get someone in front of you, whether you like it or not, for an interview, you've got formality to follow. You can't just throw it in the bin and say, I'll do what I want and I'm going to keep going at you. This was not an interview. This was just an exercise in confession bludgeoning. 6 hours of it. And it got even worse, didn't it? Because then she was subjected to 6 more interviews in a police station. So it was in a police environment. This guy was no longer police, and yet he was trying to use this leverage. Okay, certain enforcement proceedings take place in police stations, like HMRC, for example, will interview people in stations. Fine. But the point with this is, if you get someone in front of you for an interview over fraud, for example, you need to deal with it by topic, set out what the thing is, what kind of information. We're not going into it as a suspect interview. What it is a conversation with a purpose. You deal with the topic, you'll do some work and say, okay, we had an audit in this place on whatever date. We have some issues we want to discuss with you. Okay, now behind this issue is we need clarifications on these points. Can you help us with these? Not, I'm CID and you're going to have this. You know, you can't do it like that. And then the thing was, with this in mind, we're going to give you time. Did you get a chance to read this before, which you should have got before today? And are you clear with what it means? Would you like a bit more time to read it? Have you got some commitments today, childcare, or anything else that might distract you at all? Yeah. If you're not sure with asking, give the detail. This is all we're concerned. Give some detail. think about what you're saying and think after you've answered as well. And we'll give you plenty of thinking time. But the point was this, none of that. And the cognitive sort of way, as we say in our training, to help someone's memory is the way it should have gone. If, for example, can you give a figure of how many transactions you will give in a day? Open question. Well, I can't really see that. I'm not sure.
I think it would be good as well, Ian, for Nikki's case, to say that she had kept a lot of records of her own, hadn't she? She'd been trying to work out for a long time what was going wrong. And in fact, she offered the paperwork that she had to the...
She could have helped them.
She did effectively.
But they weren't interested, were they?
No, it comes back to your point. Honestly, Jill, it just comes directly back to your point of this preparation, if you like. First of all, is she was, Nikki and many of they're very meticulous professional people. You know what I mean? And they are very committed. And suddenly when three of them turn up one morning and drop on her, like they did in some great sting exercise, and then suddenly you say, okay, well, here's my records. It helps. Someone as professional, as I said just now, someone in front of you, they come in all shapes and sizes, certainly the investigations, things you'll get, for example, if you're interviewing a manager or someone very strategically minded, some of them will speak in a very coded fashion, and they will do this. And then also you'll speak with maybe numbers people. You've got to tolerate this. And someone like me who is so hopeless with names, that's it. And you can't just you're a thief, never mind all this. You lose patience like that, you've lost it. And this is what happens. And certainly coming to your point again is, here I am, here's my records, I've kept myself, go through these. Here's my bank account details, here's my accountant's details. Now, if that was me, I would have said, well, thank you very much for this. With your written authority, we'll make certain inquiries to go with it. We'll probably reconvene and we'll get some clarifications with this, see where the values and comments, points and metrics of this thing merge together. Then we'll see what kind of outcomes we get to. It's not rocket science, is it? No. The thing is, that's the way it should have gone. I would have gladly said, fine, thank you. I'll take these and we'll come back on this. But then what happened? I mean, that whole day, they locked her in for 6 hours. I mean, she went home and she was in bits. And she's told me this. And the fact is then it got even worse, didn't it? So, see, a confession, or shall I say an interview under caution, as it should be, is an exemption to the hearsay rule. So with that in mind, I looked at this and I thought to myself, well, what would have happened if Nikki had admitted to this in that first interview? I mean, where was the transcript? What happened to the tape? No caution, oppressive interrogation style questioning for 6 solid hours.
Were there no tapes of the 6 interviews that were available?
As far as no. Where did they go?
Yes, quite.
You see, and then suddenly some transcript appears down the line, which was nothing like that was said in the interview.
Well, we had an interesting situation in Swindon where an experienced detective had a conversation in the back of a car with a guy who had, I think, been found. Murder. Yeah. He'd admitted to a previous murder, and he then admitted in the car to another one to say where he'd buried the body. And the whole case, of course, went out the window because he couldn't be convicted on the basis of that conversation. No. He hadn't been cautioned. He was just having a chat. And the policeman, I think, lost his job as a result of that failure.
One sympathizes to a point, but again, you hear some familiar tales of this because they simply don't bother following the procedure. Many a times, the kind of cases I've appeared in Crown Court in at the time in the police, but ever since then, I've not left things behind. I still actively help and support law enforcement in different countries and other regulators and all that. So the kind of crossover between corporate and enforcement and where they cross together. The point is that when you decide that you're doing the right thing, remember groupthink, and it comes back to this again, it can get hold of the most, honestly, they're not all corrupt people to begin with. I know many investigators obviously, many lawyers. And one of the big things about groupthink is that it can distort your thinking. You can be led. You think you're doing the right thing with your sort of inner beliefs and all this kind of stuff. But what you're doing is there's no process. You've ditched it completely. And that's what's happened there with this case mentioned by George.
How do you combat that, Ian? How do you combat that when it's happening? Firstly, how do you notice it? And then how do you avoid it?
Well, to be honest with you, again, I mean, it's easy for me to say. I say that in honest way because in my nearly 40 years of investigation, etc., it doesn't make me better than anyone else. And only in the last few years in my kind of involvement academically, if you will, with investigative psychology, I've been able to, I encourage people to train their minds first. So you and I, you can learn your audit procedures, your compliance rules, you can know them inside and outside. People can stand up and recite them effortlessly. But the problem you've got is what you should be doing is training the mind first. Again, this wonderful model, linear, sequential, unmasking. Think this first. What am I doing here? What decisions am I making here? First of all, here and now. Somebody makes a disclosure, an utterance. Okay, pause, stop. What do I do? Not, oh, okay, thank you for confessing. You know what I mean? It's a kind of catch-22 in a way, because someone who coughs out a murder to you, you know, you're gonna respond. Of course you are. And if someone says, yeah, George, I've been stealing off you for the past year, you know, you're going to respond. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to have you in court now. You know what I mean? So this is a kind of spontaneous thing you've got to get out of your thinking. That's the way I would do it. There's an old saying, I keep saying it, is an investigation is respond, don't react. Now, once you get this firmly embedded into your, if you like, subconscious, then you're going to start making more proper rationality instead of groupthink rationality, which affected this unfortunate officer and many like him, frankly. So that's a kind of input from a training perspective, which I hope answers you.
Yeah. No, it's interesting.
Because from what you know about these cases, Ian, I don't know how many particular cases you know, but it seems as though a lot of these investigations have been done very poorly, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, you're going to get all kinds of creatures before you and the ones who approach them. Remember that detectives, investigators, everything, again, we all have different kind of tolerance levels about how we receive information. How should we receive it? I mean, the numbers of times when I've worked with auditors, oh, I've not had it. If there's a date missing on an audit report, oh, I've not had the full information here. You know, this kind of thing, the kind of tolerance level, it comes back to your point, George, before, is knowing where to start, knowing when to stop in an investigation. So in other words, what is your approach like it? And you see, how do I like to receive information in a certain perfect case study format, in a wonderfully set up email pro forma, whatever it is? If you've got something that comes through an internal process, you think, well, this is great. It's sacrosanct. It's bomb-proof. Yeah. Some people insist that all the boxes are ticked before they even touch it. I don't. I'm one of these kind of renegades who will say, okay, this is what I've got. If it's so hopeless, I'm going to go back to them. But I'm going to say, okay, let's get into the areas where we can find some information here. And it doesn't take long to do, frankly. This is the whole irony of what you said. It's not a difficult thing to do if you train the mind. As I said before, fraud is unique as a beast. Money laundering, corruption, they're so fluid in the ways they're done, the situational ways where they're committed. This is another challenge for us in fraud, why it's so unique as a crime. Do you think with the post office, though, that there may have been some investigators who really did buy into this thing? We've got Horizon. Horizon tells us the answers. We don't have to think anymore. We just ask Horizon. Horizon says 34,000, and that's it. Case done. Yep. It's as simple as that. Again, we have this element in groupthink when Irving James came with his wonderful definition in the 1970s of groupthink about basically what it drives at is shutting down all other possibility than the one that you want to follow. That's it. When you break this down further into some of these quite superb analysis, for example, again, you've got what we call invulnerability. Hits your point perfectly. Invulnerability, it means we're okay here. We're embedded in a train of thought where we can take abnormal risks. We can get into this proclivity of investigating outside of the law. Who are we accountable to? We're all in this together. There's a horizons printout. That's it done with. Shutting down innocence. On the back of these then, see, once we get this rolling along with 700 prosecutions, it becomes automated process, one after another, after another, after another. You know, this kind of consequential kind of bias, if you like. It worked last week. We're going to get this one this week. So the only objective here, it led to the most dangerous possible means of investigation, which is objectives-based investigation. There's the objective. There's the horizon. We want a confession. We want heads on plates. That's it.
And to avoid that, Ian, I mean, this teaching that you do about responding rather than reacting, how do you teach your students to tell the difference between responding and reacting? How do you help them to understand what they have to do when they see themselves, when they're in that situation where they seem to be going down a track?
Well, to be honest with you, again, in my kindness, I suppose, before most of these kind of courses, I will give a pre-reading brief, handout, whatever it is, before it, about this is what we're going to do, and read up some theory on this. And here's a healthy kind of swath of theory, because we're talking, you can call it an advanced level if you want to. I prefer to call it a proper level that we should be working to. You know, I don't pretend to be the best in the world, but what I'm saying to you is, they'll get a pre-read and they will be told in the instructions, you know, this is an element of the course where you will indulge in role play. You'll be put on the spot. You'll be hit with an incident. Are you going to respond to it? With exactly the thing. I mean, your issue with this unfortunate officer from Swindon, I will use something similar and say, okay, I confess, because we will imbue this with interview training sometimes, because I will brief, sometimes I take the part of the interviewee myself. There is nothing worse in training, frankly, and I'm still seeing it in police training of interviewing, to say, okay, suspect interview, witness interview. And what about the whistleblower who's got an ambiguous role? So with the whistleblower kind of scenario, I'll be a whistleblower and say, okay, well, I might as well tell you I was doing this myself for 6 months as well. Money laundering, yeah, siphoning out the money through the company because the boss told me to. Do as you're told. I said, okay, and so this is what I did. So there you've got a kind of half confession, unintended confession. This is about dealing with information. So I will drop it on their toes, quite mercilessly, if you sorry, and say, respond to this. Do not react. And we can do a little measurement and a little assessment and give them some feedback on that, and then we build it into the rest of the course of investigation.
So it's about getting people to think rather than just let their instinct lead them.
Yep. And again, and I'd like to kind of affirm this with, we're talking about the evidence for, you know, the great Murphy's wonderful text of criminal evidence. Again, let's just sort of really clarify this point and nail it completely. When you've got real evidence, in other words, this has happened, what evidence is that? Documentary evidence, testimonial evidence in a criminal case. What's the probity of it? What's the prejudicial effect of it? And it was absolutely riddled with prejudicial effect, the whole thing. As I said before, and I'll say it again, where was the evidence? You had data, you had information. And I saw one of your speakers on here who gave a very interesting insight of managing data. If you can't manage it, you can't say that it's fraud committed on the back of it, can you? You know what I mean? So with that in mind, when you have this thing, and there is no such thing in this case as circumstantial evidence, because you've got to have crime to have circumstantial evidence. So there's no crime. So all you had was basically a computer, fine. And it's not the argument whether it was working properly. The argument is, can you adduce and infer inference-based evidence from that system of fraud or theft? The short answer is no. And that's been obviously proved in the Court of Appeal by now with malicious prosecutions. They had no evidence at all, none. And it showed also, fast forwarding to this, and I couldn't believe my ears, in the middle of a Crown Court examination when counsel for the Post Office physically threw a bag of papers at a defendant in court. God almighty. I mean, what kind of behavior is that? But besides the kind of emotive response to it, my kind of rationality was think, well, okay, if that had hit her in the face, we'd have had an assault, wouldn't we? You know what I mean? And but tag this onto the case and tag it along. What you have is a continuation of the fact that they knew fine well that this court case, it had been blagged through the process, it had been herded through the courts, they'd sideslipped disclosure at every angle. And this guy behaves in an amount of complete exasperation to start throwing things at people in court. I mean, what is that?
And by evidence, you're talking about, as you said, you listed testimonial evidence, in other words, a witness, or documentary evidence, in other words, some kind of paperwork to confirm that there is something has actually happened.
Yeah.
And presumably other evidence of money actually missing, for example.
Well, this is the whole point. It comes back to it. In between those things, George, what you have to do, you really do have to fill those gaps, if you will, for want of ethically, with like a money laundering reporting officer in a bank will make a report to the regulator or to the enforcement authorities to say, this is a suspicious transaction of possible money laundering, whatever it is. Fine. But in the post office, what happened was, or what didn't happen was, printing is made. The expert who was then inferred the information, withdrew it from the system. Where is the evidence in between? So the real evidence will be is, here it is, I'm an expert, I'm a qualified technician, but also we have to say, on such a time, such a day, I took a reading, I then produced this, I produced that, and I handed it to someone else. You know, the continuity. It was nowhere to be seen here. We went from there to there, and at the end of it was a barrister in court clodding something at a client, a defendant in the middle of a court. Well, this is the way it's gone.
It sounded, Ian, that from what Nikki said, that in that bag were the dockets. And these are the dockets that the postmasters and mistresses post daily to Ireland, and which, in Nicola's case, the lawyers were told they don't exist anymore. You can't have them, because apparently her lawyer was saying on a repeated basis, please may we have disclosure of the dockets. And they suddenly turn up in Bristol Crown Court, and there they are in a plastic bag at the end of a trial.
You know what I say. You know, Merlin the magician couldn't have done better, could he?
No.
You know, the thing is, but on a more sort of serious note with this, you know, when that happened, you know, if they want to then start playing games and saying, okay, we can't disclose it because of reasons of national security, which is an exemption in the legislation. National security, I mean, what's the national security? But it wasn't even that. It was a case of a blanket, no, we're not doing it. And then suddenly, it's like me turning up now to you and say, here's a great bag full of data printouts. Explain those. What are you going to do? Look at me. Funnily, I hope you would. Yeah. And then suddenly, okay, they're going to disappear for a time being. And the next thing, they're going to be hurling at you face on in the middle of a court, thrown at you by a barrister. That's exactly factually how it's gone. I mean, how preposterous does it get?
Absolutely.
And why did they get away with it? I think also, if I may, the fact that leading up to the trial, that Nikki Arch was interviewed, 6 times?
I think
at least
so.
5. Yeah. I mean, forgive me, and sorry, but what was the lawyer doing? I mean, why on earth did it ever get past 2?
And from what Nikki said, actually, it sounded as though the same questions were asked of her on every occasion. It wasn't like we're going back to ask you more questions, which I could understand. You know, there have been some developments. We need to ask you about this, but not, well, what are you going to, that here is question 1. I asked you, 3 times ago, but I'm now waiting for a yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean,
this is this is it. Well, the thing is there, Jill, is this is where, again, it becomes more farcical than ever. Because if, for example, that Nikki, she's not under arrest, obviously, during the interviews. Well, apart from the official legalized kidnapping on the first morning, you know, the point is this: if she had been arrested and let out on police bail, she would go back on X day to go back for more questioning. Now, the reason that police bail exists is because you don't have enough evidence to charge. You need to let them go while you gather more evidence sufficient to get a prima facie level case to charge. Not you are guilty, but a basic case to answer.
Yeah.
There was no case to answer here, but what was happening was that the lawyer concerned was saying, okay, we got to go to another interview. Oh, we've got to go to another. We've got to go to the Stroud police station on whatever date. It should never have happened. No. What the lawyer should have done really is jump up there, start jumping up and down and say, look, you've had one interview, which is unofficial, isn't it? Yeah, which we can prove is such. Now we're in here asking the same old questions over and over and over again. How many more times is this going to happen? It should have been stopped. You need to get a supervisor. You need to get your senior manager in here right now, because this is, again, it is completely against any kind of code of practice under PACE. It is also, you know, criminal justice legislation about the admissibility of confessions. And all we're doing is hearing it same. You cannot do that. It violates bail conditions, if they were applicable, but it violates PACE codes of practice. Also, we need to stop this interview. Do you have evidence to charge her or no? Because these volunteer interviews will end right now. And what will happen also is that we will get this before the CPS, and we will make a very, very clear case for you to step in, take over this case with your statutory authority, and stop this absolute farce right now. That's what he should have been doing.
And we didn't hear that story. We haven't heard that story from any of the sub-postmasters who found themselves being interviewed. I have yet to hear of any defense lawyer who seems to have acted assertively like that.
Well, they should have done, honestly.
Oh.
You know, the times, you know, when I came out of the police force, I did some police station. I worked for a couple of law firms on a kind of a temporary placement once, and then I worked for a law firm doing this. You know, people, the funny thing is, I'm not going to digress here, but the thing is this: the perceptions of police station attendees will vary. I know some great, superbly skilled duty solicitors.
Yeah.
I've worked with, wonderful, but I've met some real not so good ones as well. And unfortunately, and I think in all honesty, George, they do get intimidated. And I think in Nicky's case, I'm sure he's a lovely man, I've no clue. But the problem is he was out of his depth. There's no question of that. And I think in these other cases, no one, again, we come back to groupthink, this kind of case of unanimity. Once the kind of groupthink effect spreads from the post office through the people, yes, you better plead guilty. It gets to the lawyers as well. Post office, computer. No one was questioning it. Nobody. And this is the way it was going. And then the lawyers, most in the main, were simply saying, oh, well, we better go to this interview as well. And yeah, you better plead guilty here. And they weren't doing it. They should have really been right up at that counter, getting right into them, eye to eye, with these investigators saying, enough is enough. Where's your evidence? What's the basis? Can you just talk me through the basis of your case and evidentially?
If anyone's listening to this and they are a defence lawyer and they've been involved in one of these cases, and actually that's what they did, we'd love to hear from them and we'd interview them.
Yeah, then I'll... But the thing is this, I mean, in all honesty, I must say, I mean, obviously the root cause of this are these, I can't say another word, corrupt investigators. I mean, if you're going to kidnap someone and interrogate them and lock them in and threaten them and prejudge their guilt by suspending them, sacking them before a trial, and then smearing their names in the newspapers, before the case is even heard in court.
I was going to say that to you when you were talking about how the post office managed to kind of dampen down the publicity about them. But what we've heard from various different postmasters is that somehow the press very quickly heard about what they'd done long before they were charged, some of them, and they were treated abysmally in their community thereafter. You know, spat at and sworn at.
It was horrible. Yes. Yeah. I mean, she's not the only one. I'm making, and honestly, I mean, how petulant does it get? Her name had been traduced publicly. They'd already found her guilty before they'd even met her, based upon this printout. That was it. No evidence, no kind of expert, not just the technical advice, but also the kind of the legal input that should have been there that was nowhere to be found. And that was it. And she was, people, gozzing on her in the street. So that's a Mancunian word. Sorry about that. But I think that the kind of thing that it's petulant, it's childish, it's vindictive, isn't it? The stereotyping, all the rest of it, this kind of thing that goes on, this kind of absolutely full-on horrible aggression that's gone on from end to end. And I think that the fact to smear her in the paper was absolutely reprehensible thing to do.
And people shouldn't underestimate the impact and the health consequences to so many of these people. We've only spoken to a few, but they've all got huge health problems.
Yeah, it's terrible. Characterized by kind of autoimmune type diseases, the kind of rheumatoid type illnesses and so on. Which are it is just horrible. And I said, this is not just the worst miscarriage of justice for no reason. And I've spoken, you mentioned before, Jill, I've spoke to quite a few. I've not just turned up today and said, here I am. I've spoken to a lot of postmasters. I've spoken to at least 3 who went to prison, who done absolutely nothing wrong, innocent people in prison by these kind of ways. So, let's have it clear here. At the end of it all, the way that this has been done, getting heads on plates, getting people banged away for nothing, is just, again, it's just beyond reprehensible, isn't it? And there is another thing, Ian, which is, this investigator that Nikki ran into saying, I know a thief when I see one. Now, you've been around and you know a thief when you've seen one. Well, I mean, it'd be a silly thing to say, but I would guess you're familiar with criminals of all stripes. But nevertheless, when we've talked to the various postmasters, they do not look like the kind of people that you find around police stations very much. Well, then I never saw one like that. I mean, well, the irony thing is, I mean, people I've mentioned about my kind of work and everything else, and people say to me, at the end of it all, George, without sounding too grand about it, I'm an investigator. I want to put fraud in the UK is out of control. That's it. I mean, what's the alternative to private prosecutions? Going to action fraud? But please, let's not go there. No, thank you. Exactly. So the thing is, I mean, my answer to this, and people say to me, accuse me, whatever you want to say, oh, Ian, whose side are you on now? All I say to that is, well, I deal in evidence. That's it. That's the answer. Absolutely. That's what I do. And I think that's my when I say I know a thief when I see one, I don't pretend that I do. You can see the hoodie, you can see the many a times I met one guy, an Albanian guy, he had a Kalashnikov tattooed on his forehead. I mean, okay, I know one when I see one, maybe. And that was true. I actually met this guy. And but by and large, I've been, again, fortunate to work with great experts in forensic psychology. A great friend of mine who's over in Bilbao in Spain. He is a world expert in non-verbal communication. But this is not just how people twitch and how people look. He does the most senior court appearances as an expert on family cases, weekly as custody cases, and he appraises interviews that he does. I've actually been in his studios in Bilbao where he does all of this. But in all honesty, George, if someone says, I know a thief when I see one, they can't possibly justify that comment, because I certainly can't pretend to do it. No one can do it.
And unless you're some kind of opinionated, kind of out of control, egocentric, kind of pretend detective, whatever it is, playing at it. But the results of that obviously went haywire. That's what the business case was for the post office. It was a business case that went haywire, really, and it was shaped into this horrible, monstrous legal hatchet job on 700 plus people. Interestingly, this man, Mr. John Scott, who was the head of the security at the post office at the time, he was named by his own barrister, his own counsel for the post office in the Court of Appeal submissions as the one who personally ordered the shredding of documentation. Now, he's the one, he's the one on his personal ordered the shredding of. Now, we can't speculate, it's probably all disappeared. What was in his mind when he ordered the shredding of documentation in-house. You can make your own inferences from this. Was it defense-related rebuttal evidence showing faults?
Yeah.
Or was it, forgive my saying it so bluntly, sheer stupidity and knee-jerk naivety management, whatever it was? I think no matter what, he's got some questions to answer about why he did what he did. It's not for me to speculate what's in his mind, but he needs to answer to lots of people about why he ordered the shredding of documentation, because he was named by his own barrister in court as doing so. That's it. It's in public. He was named in the Court of Appeal. But this was cushioned by counsel for the post office by saying, well, 2 minutes later, it wasn't all that serious, the documentation. Where does it go, this silliness?